Okay, so this is going to be a video all about today's topic, and that is crazy cartography. So what is crazy cartography? Well, cartography is map making, and I find map making absolutely fascinating. I find it a really, really interesting thing, and I do find maps very interesting to look at. And maps throughout the ages are incredibly interesting. Now, prior to the rise of Baghdad, many of the maps that were created were very, very different from what we saw or what we see today. And what we see today are very, very detailed maps. Okay, so let's have a look at some of those really detailed maps we're used to seeing today. Now, this is a really good example of digital detailed maps, the type of thing that we are used to seeing a lot more today. And this is very, very new technology. So prior to that, we would look into an atlas and we would look at an ordnance survey map, and they would provide a huge amount of detail. But this is something that you're probably more familiar with. So if we zoom in here, we're going to zoom into the United Kingdom. So I've chosen to look at the United Kingdom because we'll be very familiar with that. And here we have, in the United Kingdom, we have Scotland at the top, we have England, we have Wales, we have Ulster, Northern Ireland, and then down here we will have the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man up there. Now, we know this to be quite a detailed map, and if we zoom in a bit further and we start looking at London, and as we zoom in further into Kent, where we live, we can see there we've got the main towns and areas of Kent. So we have Canterbury, we have London right up there, the Medway towns, we have Ashford, which we're familiar with, Dover over this way. So let's zoom in a bit more. And here we can start to see boundaries of fields. We can start to see small cities. We can see towns. And as we move around, we're able to see different locations on our map. So this is one example of a map, one example of a more modern map, a digital map. And we're having a look at Kent. Now, this part of Kent I'm showing you now is called Thanet. And Thanet has quite a few important geographical locations, but a rather ancient one that Thanet has is on the way to Sandwich. If ever you're driving down to Sandwich, you'll see some ancient ruins high up on the hill. And those ancient ruins are one of the first fortifications that were built by the Romans in their invasion of Kent and then the rest of England and parts of Wales and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why I've highlighted that one, you'll find out later, but this particular ruin can be found in that part of Kent, and then when you look at it, and I've kind of left the cursor there it is, okay, Canterbury is quite far away, and then when we zoom out even further, so that my dot is on that ruin that you can see, so we zoom out even further, we then have London right over here, still out of camera shot for you, so I'm going to zoom out even further, and there we go. And so there is that fortification that I spoke about. We can see the boundary lines with the coast, we can see the boundary lines between different counties in blue, and here we have London right up here. And if I sort of zoom out a bit more, you'll see where that dot is, where I spoke about that ancient fortification. So they're considerable distances apart. Now you keep that in mind because we'll be looking at that a little bit later. So that was just a very quick example of a very modern version of a map, a digital map. Let's have a look at some of those ones that you saw right at the beginning that were from many, many years ago. Now, back to this one, and this is probably a map you might struggle to recognise. Let's zoom in just a little bit. I'll just move that camera around. So, can anyone think they can recognise what this map might be of? you may recognise parts of it. Press pause and have a think. What do you think this map is of? Now, this is an ancient map, and this is an ancient map of the world. So if we have a look at it, we can see that this part represents Africa. We can see here is the River Nile. We can see this is the Middle East. And when we come round to here, we have Turkey, Greece, Italy, Sicily, Spain, and then it's not abundantly clear. That may actually be northern France, and those are the British Isles, or it might be the British Isles have been joined onto northern France, and those are different random islands. So you can see there that in the early times, cartography, that is map making, was very much a kind of a guess in parts, and that if people drew a map, they usually like to have their country in the middle of it, and their country was the most detailed one, and everything else was either made up of other more ancient maps, and then map makers would borrow those off other ones, or if they just didn't know what was there, then they would simply just put lots of random islands in, or maybe even some monsters or something like that, just to fill the space because they weren't sure. So let's have a look at our next example. Now this one, I'm going to zoom out a bit more so you can see it. Do you recognise this part of the world? So let's have a look round for our map. Do you recognise this part of the world? Have a pause and see if you can work out where you might think it is. Okay, now this part of the world we've already seen on our first map. Okay, here we have Egypt. Here we have the Middle East. So we'll have Syria and Israel there. We've got Saudi Arabia here. We'll have Iraq here with Baghdad, Iran, and then we got Afghanistan, and we're creeping into Pakistan and India. Up here we have Turkey and Greece, and they can probably just off the map if I turn it around. There we go. So I'll do that bit again. So here we have Turkey, then we have Greece, and then we have the boot of Italy. So that is a much more detailed modern map. These lumps and bumps that we have here are mountainous regions. The flatter areas will be much lower regions where there may be deserts or valleys or even areas that may even be below sea level once you get inland. You can see the sea is in blue, and even the sea is dark and light because the darker patches represent deeper sea. So map making has come on hugely since those early creations. When we look at a map like this, people have used maps not just to map their own kingdom, but sometimes for an empire. So, do you recognise what empire this might be? Have a pause and have a think. Now, if you haven't guessed it, this was the Roman Empire at one stage. So everything in red was governed from Rome. Okay. Sometimes with empires, they would get a bit bigger. So the borders would expand out and expand up and over. And then sometimes if you had lots of enemies attacking, the borders may shrink a bit. So depending on who's in charge, which Caesar was in charge, you could find those borders might be slightly bigger or slightly smaller. And then within those borders, you had certain sections that might be individual kingdoms, or they may be rivers or areas where people may govern, and an empire would be split into lots of different regions to allow governors to be in charge of them and collect taxes. Otherwise, it would be too big for you to do that job. So maps can also not just detail things like mountains and waterways, but they can also detail political things. So the political size of an empire. Here we have another type of map. Now this one is much more detailed because not only do we have a scale, so you can actually measure it and see how far apart things are. So we know that distance there is 200 miles, that one 400, that one 600, that one 800. So if you got a ruler and measured it out, you could actually tell how far apart things are. We have the names of seas, like the Aegean Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the North Sea right up here, and the Atlantic Ocean, the Bay of Biscay. We also have the names of particular locations, such as in this case we have the Kingdom of the Visigoths. We have the Persian Kingdom just off camera. I'll just move it around so you can see that. There they are, tucked away in the corner, Persian Kingdom. Dalmatia, right in the middle, Italy. So in this particular map, you can see that there are different kingdoms. We have the Byzantine Empire, that was the leftovers from the Roman Empire, renamed by history. And so you can see that has shrunk. As I mentioned, that sometimes they get smaller and different kingdoms pop up in competition. But this one is more detailed because it shows capital cities, it shows regions, it shows major cities, it shows seas, and it shows regions where you may have tribes of people. So those people may not have an actual border to their country, but they roughly live around this area, and they may roam around that area and not have a particular place to live, but maybe nomadic, set up their tents, move around that particular area, then move around again. Then every few years, every few months, they move within that area. So this is reflecting a static kingdom, a kingdom where there are cities and towns and things don't move. And it may also represent kingdoms and locations where peoples do move around and they do shift their living places from one location to another. So again, maps can show much more detail than the previous one, as we're seeing here.